Am I looking at you, Fred?
Good evening and welcome to another town hall meeting around the DA's Gauteng manifesto. So just north of 2.5 million citizens of Gauteng are without jobs. About 611,000 have just given up and are not looking at jobs anymore or looking for jobs anymore. So you've guessed it, we're talking jobs tonight. I'm Fred Nell, and with me, Moeletsi and Mbeki. Very welcome. Moeletsi is the chairperson of the South African Institute of International Affairs, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here. And then Msimanga, the Gauteng Premier candidate for the DA. Good evening, Solly.
Good evening, Fred. Thank you very much.
So, since we're talking jobs, Moeletsi, let me throw this difficult question out to you immediately. How do you create jobs?
Well, how you create jobs is by investing. That's the only way, actually, that humanity, since humanity came to this earth, that's how it created jobs, is by investing. For example, after you harvest your maize, let's take a farmer. The farmer has to save some of the maize so that in the next season he or she has a seed to plant. So the farmer has to grow more than what his family needs to eat, because he needs to save some of the maize in order to use it as a seed during the following season. So this may sound very elementary, but it applies whether you are the inventor or the maker of robots and artificial intelligence, or whether you make aeroplanes, whether you raise cattle. You still have to save in order to expand your business and to create jobs. And the more jobs you create, the more profit you make. And this is one of the messages people don't understand, is that the more people you employ, the more your revenues get larger, and your profit margin obviously gets larger. So it's a win-win formula, investing and creating jobs. It's a win-win formula for the whole society, not just for the investor.
All right, remember that you can send us your questions on the channel that you're watching on, either our YouTube channel or our Facebook channel. So please feel free. Later in the program, we'll be asking those questions to the panelists, so make them as difficult as possible. So, so Moeletsi talks about the importance of investment. Surely that sounds like a very easy formula. Just attract investors to Gauteng and poof, we're going to have a lot of jobs.
Well, look, I mean, Baba Moeletsi is speaking about certain things that are important. Talks about, there's no way you can get the economy going or give people a quality of life if you're not investing. But what is also important is, a government investing so that it can attract investors to come and invest. So you can talk about, the creation of jobs of government, but government can only hire people, so many people. But if you create an environment in which then creates conducive space for investors to then come in, that's where you get real investment. Companies, and now, finding ourselves living in a global village where there is actual real competition, from country to country, even within South Africa, from province to province, in terms of who's able to then attract the investors. We now need to then say, in order to attract investment and to then get employment and jobs going, what is government doing in the first instance? Do people and potential investors, or even those that are invested in your area, feel safe? First of all, do they feel that they can tap into your labor market to then be able to then get the kind of skills that they need for whatever business that they're running? Is it possible to then look at the infrastructure and say that its infrastructure is supporting, the business that I want to then run? Mbeki says, if you look at how more people are getting employed, which leads to more people being able to then pay taxes and all of that. government needs to then invest first of all, because those taxes coming in is a sign of a return on the investment, because it means that you have less and less more or less and less people depending on the grant system, and more people are in the job space who are able to then pay tax, which means that you get more revenue, and the more revenue you're able to then get, the more you're able to then get certain things done, like build better schools, better clinics, better hospitals, and ensure that your police are able to then do much more. So again, investors are sitting with money. Investors wants to then come in, but they are saying, what is government investing in? And there's a correlation between where there is investment by government and where there is investment by the private sector. If you don't invest in your infrastructure, in safety and security, in good education, in good healthcare, you're not going to attract investment into your area. And I think this is where we now need to then say, is it easy to just attract investment? The answer is yes and no. It's easy when you have the right systems in place. It's difficult when you don't have these things in place to be able to attract investors.
Moeletsi, what's your opinion? I mean, how attractive would a place like Gauteng, which is the economic powerhouse of our country, how attractive are we to foreign and even domestic investors at this point?
Well, I have my own little company which is based in Gauteng, so it's attractive in the sense that there are many other companies who I work with. So if I want, and there are many skilled people who are in the market. So if I need a specialized worker in Gauteng, you are more likely to find that person than in the rural areas, for example, or in the small towns. So Gauteng is very attractive as an investment destination. But as Soli says, investment, there is actually a division of labor between private investors and the government. The government has a certain assignment in terms of creating infrastructure like roads, railways, and so on, education. And the private sector also has its own assignment. So you have to see it as a community, as how you develop your community. There's division of labor in all communities. So it's not that the private sector and the government are different components. They are part of the same community of Gauteng. And Gauteng operates and creates livelihoods for all citizens of Gauteng through these corporations. There's a lot of cooperation amongst investors themselves without government, directly between themselves. So it's a process of cooperation, but that cooperation has to happen, and those who are supposed to do their assignment in the division of labor have to deliver. And this is one of the problems we have in South Africa, is that one side of the delivery is not happening, which is the state side. The state is not delivering on its assignment, which then impact adversely on the other investors, whether they're government investors, public sector investors, local government investors, provincial investors, private investors. They are impacted if one of the partners of the stakeholders is not fulfilling their part of the bargain.
Soli, I mean, the picture that Moeletsi paints is that Gauteng has huge potential. We've got skilled labor, we've got an intricate business network, we've got communication systems. We, as he said, in his business, he can touch base with whatever he needs in order to service his business. But then why are we not attracting billions and billions of rand of investment at this stage?
Well, Fred, I think you need to go back into history, and this is why this place is called Gauteng. You can go back to the golden era of gold, if you like, in Gauteng. You were attracting migrants from all over South Africa and all over Africa. You had people that were coming as far as Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, people were coming here, to work, and they got integrated here. And you had so much business that was focused around Gauteng, and particularly Johannesburg, where it started, with the mines. And this is why you also have the financial hub of South Africa being based, in Johannesburg. So you had an economy that had been built, that had been resilient for over 150 years, and then it's been going on like that. But what you end up having is that you now have a situation where, because you have had a resilient, economy that has been there, irrespective of what government has been doing. You've had a resilient economy that has been there, as Moeletsi has said, that if the moment one or other partner fails to bring their part, it then impairs the others from doing what needs to be done. What do I mean by that? So the economy of Gauteng has been resilient, and people are invested here. You can go into the north of Gauteng, your Pretoria area. You have BMW, Nissan, Ford that has invested billions. You go into Sandton here, the richest square mile, where you have the headquarters of some of the biggest, entities that are here. People are already invested here, so it's very difficult for them to then automatically just pull out. But what they want is reassurance that government is doing something about keeping their investment here. And government's responsibility is to then ensure that it makes life a whole lot easier for them. Companies needs to be profitable. The more profitable the companies are, the more they're able to then create more jobs, the more they're able to reinvest, as Moeletsi has said. But we now need to then say, what do we need to then do? The fact that you're sitting with electricity problems, the fact that you're sitting with water problems, the fact that you, as a logistics province, you cannot move goods and services cheaper, faster. That is a problem. You have an airport that should actually be a hub that is able to then deal with some of these things. And our airport is not what it used to be or what it should be. That's the first thing. You don't have rail that is supporting your infrastructure, or the infrastructure rail is able to then support the moving of people and the goods. You also now don't even have, as I said earlier on, a guaranteed supply of electricity and also of water. I mean, you have companies like Nampek who are saying we cannot produce, the kind of paper, the quality and the right quantity and at the right time, because, we are reliant on the correct supply of water. But also, more than that, investors are saying, are you investing in safety and security? Will my trucks be hijacked? As an example, will my employees, be prevented from coming to work? We've had cases now of things like the business forums, as an example, which is now becoming a big issue around Gauteng. To then say, people who want to then invest. I mean, malls, the building of malls, the building of clinics, the building of certain things is now being ground to a halt by people, who are saying, I want 30%, we want protection fee and things like that. Those are issues of safety and security. How do you protect people? How do you protect goods and services? And how do you, more importantly, ensure a supply of your skilled people? And Gauteng has been able to then do that. But we don't have the investment that is coming in from the private sector, because government on its own has now also stopped or has failed to invest enough in the infrastructure, the safety and security, and also ensure that the quality in terms of education is able to then foresee or the kind of the demand in terms of the skills that is required. Those are the ingredients that we now need to put together. And you can go to the private sector and say, I've invested in these things. Now come and invest, and investors will naturally then begin to then flock to you.
Melissa, let's unpack some of these impacts that could be inhibitors to investors to come to Gauteng. I mean, we've been without load shedding now for a few weeks, which is bliss. I think it's almost like a Christmas present. Many of us are a bit skeptical that it will come back at some stage, and it might be related to the elections, but doesn't matter. What impact does something like load shedding have on businesses and attracting business?
It has a huge impact. My company, I have an extra cost of running a diesel generator. That's what it does. It adds to your costs. And of course, it makes you uncompetitive if your costs are going higher. So it's a direct. It has a very direct implication on the profitability of companies. That companies are having to run diesel generators, are having to put up um, their own power plants. Whether it's photovoltaic cells and so on. That should be the central power generate owner, the people who generate power, the because you see the national generator has economies of scale. I don't have economy of scale. My little generator in my company is totally out of sync with economies of scales. So it sends my costs sky high, and the products that I sell, it makes them very, very expensive. So the question of the people responsible for supplying national power from the grid, that is why there are people who have to supply power from the grid. It doesn't actually matter whether it is a state company or a private company. In some countries, it's a private company. In some countries, China, for example, a lot of those are state company, but they have to supply power at a competitive rate globally. So that whether they are public owned or privately owned, they have to supply power when it is needed, in the quantities it's needed, at the price at which it's needed by the rest by the other stakeholders in the production system of your society. So that's one of the problems we have in South Africa. And, and you can take that across the board into our education system. Our education system is not producing the quality of skills that our competitors produce. For example, the World Bank has what they call a human capital index, which measures the skills level of your population and how well that skills is managed. Out of something like 170 countries, South Africa is number 135, and it is 12th out of below other African countries. So you can see that now, if you haven't got the human capital that you need, and the state, which is responsible for the mass education, for the education of the mass of the population, is unable to produce the quality of human capital, then you can't compete against China. Then China is going to overrun your own companies and your own market. And then your unemployment is going to grow. And so you get into a vicious cycle.
Solly, it's clear that you need a whole bunch of things that needs to be in place. Your education needs to be in place. Your infrastructure needs to be in place. So how do we fix these things? I mean, how do we fix infrastructure, for instance, which obviously, if you want to set up a factory, you want consistent water supply, you want consistent electricity supply, you want good roads in order to transport your goods, or rail for that matter. How do we turn that around?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge one thing, that the South African government has been more reactive in the longest of time. Whoever's making the biggest noise and toying and burning the trees and burning, not the trees, but burning the clinics and burning, rail and blocking roads is the one that gets the attention. Whereas what we should be saying is, where is our economic trajectory? And where do we want to then invest? And then you bring in all spheres of government, local, provincial, and at a national level. You then say, okay, are we able to then start planning what the infrastructure contributions should be to the economy that we want to then drive. But let me bring it to the provincial level. I've always said that we need a Gauteng infrastructure master plan. Gauteng is an integrated city region. So you now don't know when Ekurhuleni ends and Johannesburg starts, or where Tshwane ends and Johannesburg starts, or where, Ekurhuleni ends and then Meerton starts, as an example, or Midvaal starts. So what you now need to then say is, if we understand that these are things that are interconnected and joined, therefore you now need to then have an infrastructure plan that talks to all of them. Yes, you might need different municipalities to do certain things, but all these things that they are doing need to talk to each other. The road that will lead from Johannesburg to to Tshwane, how is it maintained? What are we doing? And I'm not only talking about the N1 as an example. There's also many other alternative routes that are there. What are we doing with it? The water that is coming from Val through rainwater, through Ekurhuleni to Tshwane. How are we treating that pipeline to go all the way to Tshwane? What is happening there? How is it connected to Lanseria, as an example? Because that's what it does. It does a loop. So how are we taking care of that infrastructure? And also, how do we then ensure that at a local level, the coordination of how we are building towns going forward is talking to that which we want to then achieve? I've said we need to stop building slums. You go to a place like Pennyville, as an example. This government decided to just go and build, houses, but there's just houses, but without any other amenities. There's no schools close by. There's no clinics close by. There's nothing that is there that says this is a community that we're building. There's no business activities that is taking place. Therefore, you build dormitories. We now need to then say, how is our infrastructure supporting the ability of investors to also then come in, so that you're able to build a whole of society, that you're able to then build where people are settled, but where people can work, where people can access other social, infrastructure or social services, your police, your health, your education. You're able to then do that. And I think it will go a long way in driving the kind of economy that we want. But again, as I said, and going back to the point I was making, it starts with where you as government put money first. And you can see, as I said earlier on, where you put money, investors flow. Johannesburg, it was gold, but after that, there was infrastructure, resilient infrastructure that has been built. This is why you have something like the station here, the taxi rank, North. You have North, which was able to then connect people all over, South Africa. You had rail that was able to run from Johannesburg all the way to Maputo, or all the way to, to Zimbabwe, all the way to Cape Town, which was connected around Johannesburg. It's when you build infrastructure around, that the economy then around that then grows. But once that infrastructure starts to fall apart, you will see investment and investors also now beginning to disappear.
Remember to post your questions on our channel, and we will pose it to our panel here. Moeletsi, so obviously we need infrastructure, but you also raised a very important point around education. How do you determine what the skills are, especially towards the future, that you need to generate in order to attract investors to come here? I mean, government obviously is a primary player in providing education to our nation. What, in your view, how do we deal with that?
Well, when Solly was speaking, I was thinking that, but Solly is part of the state. He's part of government. His party is running the city of Tshwane. Yeah. And the politicians really have a lot to answer for. Because, for example, the other day, we all saw on television politicians throwing bottles of water at one another at a municipality meeting. Now, that doesn't give an investor confidence that our partner, as the private sector, our partner is focusing on what he or she should be doing. So that is one part which really has to also be sorted out. Our politics in South Africa, and especially in Gauteng, because remember, Gauteng is our industrial hub. It's the hub of our economy. It's not just the hub of the South African economy, is the hub of the Southern African economy. So the economy of Congo DRC, and the copper belt in Zambia and the copper belt in the Congo depends on Gauteng for its food, for example. It depends on Gauteng for its engineering products. Gauteng is the heart of engineering, not just in South Africa, but in Africa. So those are the dynamics that have to be added. But engineering requires high levels of manual skill and of intellectual skill. And that's where the education system comes in. We have lots of countries which have come from nowhere, like South Korea, but have had to build up their skills. And at the end of the day, the state and the government and the opposition parties, they are responsible for this. Industry will tell you what skills it wants. So they can't say we don't know what skills to produce. They know what skills to produce. If you go to the automobile industry, if you go to the food processing industry, they will tell you we need somebody who can bake a cake that's as good as any cake that the Germans can make. But that requires training. So that's, to me, is where our shortcoming is also. It's not just the state itself, but it's our political parties themselves are not really making the state accountable.
So Moeletsi talk about, you use the word partner.
Yeah.
So partnerships are obviously very important in all of this. And how do we foster these partnerships? I mean, it seems like, we often talk about public-private partnerships, but then these things take years to get off the ground. Is it really that difficult to build these partnerships?
Well, look, I think maybe just to start off by saying, I agree with Ntate Moeletsi in terms of what we display from a government perspective. And when I'm saying we, I mean, it's easy to then try and take the DA out, but I think we're talking about all players. I think there is a better role that can be played, so that I do take. And I think it also then puts a very wrong picture when you're having people who are legislators, behaving in a manner that is untowards, because it then says, how do you expect the rest of the country to behave if you as lawmakers, as you as leaders are behaving in a manner that you do? So that is a problem. But then you then take a step back and then say, look, what do we now need to then do? I think we need to then be able to distinguish one thing, is that there has always been solutions that have been proposed time and time again to government and to the governing party. And unfortunately, something that I call the tyranny of the majority has always kicked in. The tyranny of the majority, where even if an idea is good, but given the fact that it's not coming from the majority, they will even want to subject it to a vote and even vote you down, even when there's a brilliant plan. I mean, I can give you a number of examples. The fact that we ended up having life as a demani as an example. This was something that was said that you are going to have a problem. But again, it was subjected to then say, no, we want to do it. All who agree with this report, let it go through. And what did we have? We ended up having a serious problem. And then, there's quite a number of examples that I can give you. But let's bring it back to, what do we then do? And this is the question that you were asking. The things that government should do is to then make sure that it cuts red tape so that it becomes easy for business to be able to then do what they need to then do. So you were asking, are we a hindrance to then attracting investment and to do what needs to be done? And the answer is yes. We still have some very draconian laws that are there that are preventing or that are making us unattractive to investors to be able to then invest. And government can do that. Government must look at that and say, what is the ease of doing business in South Africa? What is the ease of doing business in Gauteng? And also, are we able to then reduce certain taxes so that we're able to then have your special tax zones, that also then become attractive for people who want to then come in. And for them coming in, you are able to then say, look, we want you to come in. This is a special tax zone, but we want you to then employ more people. And then, it becomes a win-win. Ultimately, you are able, as much as this company is supposed to be paying you much more tax, but you're getting more tax through, your employee, your employee tax, which is then something that, becomes a win-win, less dependent on the state by, individuals who are now on grant system and all of that. So you look at those things and then you say, then how do I cut this red tape? How do I also then ensure that I'm able to then decisively deal with issues of corruption? Because that is also now a hindrance in attracting businesses. I've met with people who say, I wanted to invest, but then I was asked by this department or these people or whatever, that what is in it for me, what am I getting on the end? And I end up saying, but well, I'll rather sit with my money because I don't want to be involved in this kind of thing. So cut corruption, cut red tape, and then ensure that you're able to then make the ease of doing business much more easier, and also bring in incentives that is able to then attract the private sector. That's what we now need to then do. And unfortunately, this is not what we have been doing all along.
Moeletsi, you referred to your own business. So I assume you're a bit of an entrepreneur as well, amongst many other things. How much of a burden is the administration in terms of statutory things that you have to deal with in your business? How much of that is a burden on your business as a cost?
Well, for business has to account and has to be accountable, and there has to be legislation to create an environment where there is no corruption, where there is no abuse of workers, and then where there is no abuse of other investors. So we do need regulation in the business environment. However, you can end up with an obsession with legislation. I was reading I think on Sunday, the Minister of Home Affairs, he is describing what regulations he is introducing for spaza shops. Now, first, why is it the Minister of Home Affairs who is regulating spaza shops? That should be the Minister of Trade and Industry, Commerce, and so on. Anyway, the Minister of Home Affairs is introducing this crazy regulations about what the owner of the spaza shop can or cannot do. Now, one of the biggest complaints about the South African economy is that it has got a small informal sector as a section of the economy, which is one of the reasons why we have such large unemployed population, is because our informal sector is not employing enough people. The Minister of Home Affairs is saying, forget that employment creation I'm going to load this spaza shop with more and more regulation. First, they have to be audited. I don't know if this guy knows how much it costs to get an audit. A spaza shop cannot afford to go out and hire Deloitte and Touche or KPMG or whatever to audit. They don't have the revenues. They don't have the revenues to finance an auditor. And why does he need this auditor to audit a spaza shop? So this is one of our huge problems in our country. Is there was an interview actually in the Sunday Times with the CEO of the Consumer Goods Council. Now, this lady points out that they are the second largest employer in South Africa. They employ 2.5 million people, but there are certain skills that South Africa doesn't have, which they have to import. Every country imports skills. Even the United States imports skills. So she was saying she was very happy when the government announced that they were appointing somebody to cut the red tape. And she said it's taken more than 2 years before they can meet the red tape cutter.
There's red tape involved in cutting the red tape.
Yeah. So we're having a situation in the country. You see, from my point of view as a private sector operator, I still have to come back to our politicians. We don't have competitive political space. We have to have competitive political space so that if one government, one party is not doing what the nation needs to have done, then we have to have another party replace it. But our opposition parties seem to spend more time fighting amongst themselves instead of creating a viable opposition that can replace each other, that can replace the governing party. So this is one of the environmental problems about our business shortcoming in South Africa is we have very weak opposition parties. And this is another obstacle to economic growth. They don't see it that way, the politicians. But actually, weak opposition parties in a democracy is an obstacle to economic growth.
Yeah, I don't know which is more expensive, an auditor or an anesthetist, but I know what we pay for our audits here in the DA in Gauteng every year. It's massive amounts. But so Moeletsi, he speaks about the politicians. I mean, he's pointing quite a lot of fingers at us. And he also mentioned, politicians throwing bottles at each other. So very often the political environment looks chaotic. And politicians have this reputation for being corrupt. How much of an impact does corruption have on growing the economy and instilling confidence in our economy?
Well, first of all, Fred, the issue of politicians fighting is not a South African phenomenon. I've seen Japanese and, is it Japan or China, where people were actually then on desk kicking each other and throwing shoes, and, that happens. It goes with the robustness of your debates. But what keeps people in the private sector invested in your country, in your city, in your province, is certainty on a number of things. Policy certainty, investment on your infrastructure, as I said earlier on, investment on the safety and security of the people, and also incentives. So the more incentives that you have for people to then continue to invest, that's what is going to keep people. So you can have internal fights and all of that as government, but as long as there is those principles that are there that says this is the policy of government going into on the economy, this is what we now need to then do. That's the first thing that you now need to then get in place. You need to get straight and get in place. The second issue that you now need to then look at is what is the sectors of the economy that we want to then be growing in, and what we want to then be using to build the resilient South Africa or resilient Gauteng. Because you start answering that, it then talks to where you also now invest as government. Are we wanting to have, people that are manufacturers? Are we looking at education that talks to that? Are we looking at incentivizing people that are able to not only teach that, but opening up avenues that even the curriculum is actually then talking to them? Because I think that's another thing that seems to be a problem that hasn't been addressed in South Africa. There was a time where we were talking about being manufacturers. I remember people do woodwork at school. What has happened to that? I remember having schools that, children who were not academically gifted, from an early age, they were able to then be detected, and then they were able to then be rechanneled towards those schools of specialization. And that's how you ended up having people that were able to then do engineering work or artisan work and all of that. But that is now gone. And this is why you've also now lost. And South Africa, by the way, has been the biggest exporter of skills. You know, you go to Australia, look at the engineers that are there, look at the boiler makers that are there. You go to, to the UK, look at the number of nurses that are coming from South Africa that had actually then migrated to that. And it's because it shows that at some point we had the ability to build the skills, but we were not able to then keep them here we were not able to then sustain that. And I think that's what we now need to then go back to then say, are we able to then start building that which we are going to need as a country to build a resilient economy and build a resilient country with services and the economy that is growing in the right direction. But secondly, are we also able to then become competitive? And introduce incentives that are going to make us much more competitive. And I think answering that, and as we have been saying, cutting the red tape is going to be what is going to take us forward. At this point, unfortunately, I don't think that we have been able to do that fully, but it's something that we have to then say, doing an analysis, we have to then now say, how do we then take it forward?
Moeletsi, in terms of your view on corruption, I mean, do you believe that it has an impact on doing business in South Africa?
Oh, corruption is very destructive. You shouldn't, no one should underestimate the destructiveness of corruption. It's hugely destructive. I have had my own direct experience of corruption in the Eastern Cape, for example. We used to have a construction company. I was a partner in a construction company. And we made a proposal to rebuild the center of Alice, which is where Fort Hare University is, because the community there is very underserviced, where it hasn't got a proper town center, it doesn't have a proper high schools. So we raised money, my company raised money from one of our big banks to redevelop literally a new town center in Alice. So the land owned by the municipality was there, and it was where the new city center was going to be built. So tenders were invited by the mayor, and proposals were sent in. My company also sent in a proposal. I think there were 5 different companies that sent in a proposal about how to build literally a new town in Alice. On the day that the tenders were supposed to be opened, an interdict arrived from the court from a businessman who had bought the municipal land secretly from the mayor. The mayor had sold this municipal land where we were going to build the town center, had sold it to a private businessman, and he had pocketed the money, the mayor, and he was an ANC mayor. So we couldn't develop. And as I'm talking to you, the city of Alice is still not developed. So corruption is hugely expensive.
Solly, so first question from the online group here, nice political one for you. What's your thoughts on Lesufi's Nasi Spani? They call it a scam, but let's call it a program.
Yeah. Look, I think you'd ask earlier on about corruption. This year we'll be celebrating 30 years of democracy, and I'm sure there will be a whole lot of numbers that will be thrown around to say, so many houses have been built, so many this has been done. What the question you need to ask is, at what cost? And how has, the last while sort of engineered, if you may, engineered the kind of corrupt environment that we find ourselves in. First of all, South Africa in the last while hasn't been real producers. We haven't really built new producers. We've built a whole lot of middlemen. So I'll give you an example. You want to, you want the 1,000 mics to be provided. Instead of going to people who are producers of mic, you then say, no, how many middlemen do we have in place? So this one goes to that one, and that one, before we get to the person who's doing that. And this one, and this one, and that one, and the one who's now issuing out the tender is expecting a cut. So you see, it then now depletes the resources of government, and you end up not even being able to then have an impact on the ground in terms of what can be actually delivered, because there's so much that, so much money that is going, that at the end of the day you're spending so little, but or you're getting so little for so much that has been spent, which has been lost in the in between. And this is why I'm saying we've created and a false economy of not having producers, but false economy of having a whole lot of middlemen. That is the problem that needs to be dealt with when you want to then really deal with corruption. But you've asked about the issue of Nasispan. I think for me, this is a desperate attempt for somebody who then sees that, now the time is almost up. The time is up. A desperation in terms of saying, how do we use the state resources? And unfortunately, even taking resources from other programs. I mean, you're now taking money away from the social development. You're taking money from NGOs. You're taking money from those that are helping, government to do what needs to be done. And you're now wanting to then flaunt these things, calling it, job creations and all of that, which are not permanent, as we have heard last week, the people that were told that they're employed on a permanent basis are actually not employed on a permanent basis. Now they are still going to need to go through training and so on and so forth. So now you're sitting with that, but you're also now sitting with desperation in terms of programs that are introduced that are not interlinked to any other government programs that is seriously looking at improving the people's quality of life. Mapanyas is an example of that. They don't form part of an integrated crime fighting operation in Gauteng or in South Africa. They were just introduced because Panyaza wanted to then have more people. Right now, he's introducing a system where he says he wants to employ 500,000 people with 7,000 rand a month. That's 3.5 billion rand a month. Government doesn't even have that kind of money, to then go ahead. But again, these are people that are being told this is what needs to be done, and they are going to be paying for people to go to universities and this and that and that. He says that they have an agreement with the Department of Labor. While we know that Treasury has said that we don't even have a new money that is coming into provinces or that is coming into the department. So where's that new money coming from? That now they are having 3.4 billion rand every month to be able to then pay, for stipends and to be paying for fees. So this is a desperate attempt. I wish this has been a program that had been implemented over the years, if it was done properly, which is something that we would want to then do, because there's a very big gap in terms of government. That's the first thing. You go to schools, there's a shortage of teachers, qualified good teachers. You go to hospitals, there's a shortage of nurses, of doctors, while we have nurses and doctors that are qualified sitting at home. You are now in need of boiler makers or artisans that are supposed to be assisting with rebuilding some of our infrastructure. We're not able to do that. You are now having the need in the police. I mean, the police are now sitting with a 42% vacancy, as I said earlier on, and a 52% in intelligence. But yet we are not able to then get those skills in and make sure that we're able to then do that. And this is not something that you do overnight. It's something that you build as you build your cash reserves, and you're able to then fund these and be able to work it into a program. I had challenged Panyaza, even today, I'm still challenging him to show us where this thing had been discussed and what plan does Mapanyaza or Nasispani form an integrated part of government employment rollout going forward. There's nothing. And this is, again, as I said, a desperate attempt, to win votes. And this is why people are now called to stadiums. Why do you want to call people to stadiums? To display them, to say, I'm doing this. If you're doing something, you should have been doing it in offices where the departments can actually interact with the people and then be able to then get CVs, vet people, take them through training if needs be, and then employ them. Why do you call them to stadiums? Why do you then go in certain instances and ask your councillors to bring in CVs of members of your political party if that is indeed what you were intending to do? And this is why we're saying this smacks of desperation. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, we need to find a way of making sure that we create an environment and space where real jobs can be created. People can find meaningful, employment where they'll be able to be less dependent on the state in terms of grants, but be able to then stand on their own.
Moeletsi, I want to come back almost to where we started this discussion. I won't ask you political questions, but when we look at programs like Nasi Spani and so on, it almost creates the impression that government feels that the economy has failed and therefore it now needs to become the main employment generator in our country. Do they have a point?
No, I don't think they have a point. South Africa has a lot of money. We have huge pension funds in this country. That's savings which should go into investment. And the private sector generates its own cash, and it's sitting on lots and lots of cash. But if a train from Johannesburg to Durban is going to be looted by criminals on the way there, is going to take 2 or 3 days, and so on and so forth, then I can't invest the money when I'm faced with those obstacles. I was reading somewhere that today more of our freight goes by road than by train. Now, South Africa is a very big country. You can't afford to be having freight going by road. So these are all the shortcomings that investors are faced with. You've got miles and miles or kilometers and kilometers of trucks chewing outside Richards Bay. That's dead capital. It's costing the owners of that freight and of those trucks billions of rands just waiting. When we have a railway line that goes to Richards Bay. So those are the real challenges that have to be solved.
Solly, we talk about making ease of business or creating an environment where it's easy to do business. Let's focus a little bit on the labor market. How do you make it easier for businesses to absorb more people to employ them?
So I think Mbeki spoke about how do you then strike a balance between workers' rights and also protecting against exploitation. That's the first thing. But also ensuring that you don't bring draconian laws that end up even, detracting from what you're trying to do, where you end up having no investors that are willing to then touch you with a 100-yard pole. So striking that balance means government need to then also be attractive to investors as much as it's protecting its its asset, that is the people. But what we have seen now is that you have been having certain unions that have been bullying government into making certain concessions, but that has not been met by what the private sector wants to then do. And this is why you've had so many in the private sector saying, I'd rather than start pulling out. You've had companies and mines and all of that who say, look, yes, we want to make profit, but we also want to then engage you in a way that is also sustainable in terms of creating employment and actually then keeping people employed. But if there are demands that are made to a point where it doesn't even make business sense to then continue, you are going to then have a challenge. And also, how do we then, and this is the challenge that I've made to then unions, to then say, is the unions really about creating an environment where jobs can be created, or are they more interested in protecting their constituency, that is those that are already in employment? What about those that are not in employment? Can we strike a balance in there, and can we then have meaningful engagements? And we have seen it even in within government, where governments will say, but we don't have money in terms of salaries. We're already using almost 70% of our money in terms of paying government salaries instead of them delivering. So are we able to then say at some point, what is then that balance that we now need to then strike conversations where unions are unions and not influencing government or in government and private sector also, it becomes almost like a triangle. There's government, there's the private sector, there's the union, but all of them having an equal say in terms of what is to be done and being able to then strike a balance. And I think that's where needs to happen. The Moeletsi talks about people that are now not investing because they're sitting on reserves. They're sitting on their money and say, I'm not going to invest if this is where we're going. We now need to unlock that. I was listening, I think it was the CEO of one of the major banks who was saying there's over R1 trillion in reserves that is sitting in South Africa. And when you start asking big business, but why are you not investing? They say, no, I cannot invest where tomorrow there is so much uncertainty that my investment is going to be swallowed or banned because, there is, unrest upon unrest upon unrest, or strikes that are pushing me into a particular corner without engaging in a way that also the business interests are then taken into consideration. That's where we now need to then strike a balance and say the interest of the workers must be protected. Agreed. The investors who are then bringing in employment, also those rights needs to be protected. Government, where do you find yourself? It cannot be that they are beholden to their tripartite alliance partners or the unions who are then say, if you don't do this, then we are not going to be able to then support you in the upcoming elections. And I think we're marching towards that. We're marching towards having a government that is not going to be part of, it's not going to be unionized, if I may call it that. And I think maybe that's where we now need to then be. And we've seen it in countries where there is actually then an economy that is moving in the right direction, that unions have a role to play. Yes, they are there, but then they're also not really influencing the final decisions that government is making and what the private sector is doing. And I think that's where we now need to then do. The constitution is a fine piece of work in South Africa that, it protects everybody's rights. But at the same time, we now need to then make sure that we start thinking about what is it that we want to then achieve. And are really all the things that we have been doing as union representatives, as government and the private sector really conducive for the environment which we want.
Moeletsi, do you think it must be easier for business to hire and fire?
Well, I worked for COSATU. I was head of communication for COSATU for 3 years in the early 90s. And what was in COSATU was very strong those days, and they were opposed to, for example, the government fixing a minimum wage. They said the wage must be negotiated between the employer, the management, and the unions. Today, government is fixing the minimum wage. Why? Because the union leaders have neglected their own organizations. Now they are falling back on the government to try and get protection from the government. The question of hire and fire is actually to be negotiated by the management and the workers and the unions. That's what it should be. And the union leadership in South Africa has failed the members. They are protecting themselves, the union leaders. They're getting jobs as ministers in government. So it's not, and the government cannot legislate the hire fire issues. It can create an environment for the negotiation to be fair negotiation between the parties, but the unions and the management have to negotiate the environment. Otherwise, you create these rigidities in the economy, which then hobble the economy from developing, and they protect minorities. It becomes protected employment for a few. So those are the challenges that have to be addressed. But, Fred, it takes us back to the question of the opposition parties. We have 52 opposition parties standing for parliament. Well, that doesn't make sense because the ANC in the last election had 57% of the vote. What will this 51? What will they be doing? They will be splitting the 47%, my arithmetic, the 47% between them. So they are not giving a realistic opposition competitive environment. So instead of us having 52 opposition parties, they have to create an opposition party that is as strong as the ruling party. Whether they love each other or not, the point is that for the advancement of our democracy, for the advancement of the country, we need to have real competitive politics. 52 political parties can't create a competitive environment.
Respond to that.
I'm torn in that because being a constitutionalist, I believe in democratic processes where people can actually have a voice, freedom of association, and can then decide to form organization. But I do take where Mbeki is coming from, because you need to create a strong opposition that has a realistic chance of taking power, and actually then reducing the majority of a governing party. And you need to have that competition, that says, this time, if I'm not going to be able to then deliver, I don't have the guarantee that the next time I am going to be voted in. But if you then have diluted, your opposition, you are actually might end up in a situation where, even when people are tired, but because it's just so very much split, that you're not even going to be able to then achieve that. And whereas when you're having government resources that are now being abused and used, towards the benefit of a certain political party that is in government, it actually even create a bigger, chaos. Right now, we're sitting with people that are getting 350 rands grants, and they are told, no, you are getting this because of this government. And this is how people tend to think and believe. So you see, that aspect is then consolidated in terms of a particular vote. But those that are saying, no, we want jobs, we want this, become so much divided in terms of what is it that they want and how do they get there. And because there's so many voices that are coming, as that Moeletsi has said, then you don't have a consolidated opposition that is able to then present a clear alternative that can attract a majority of the people that should be attracted when people are saying we are done with this government. So whether we can have and it looks like it's an African phenomenon. So you go into some of the states in Africa where you're having 100, 200 parties contesting for elections, and end up in elections that the results thereof are contested over and over again, and it becomes now a very bad cycle that plays itself out. So what we need, and I do agree that we need a consolidation, and this is why the DA has actually then come up with a Moonshot Pact, and then the multi-party got together to then say, are we able to then start putting our differences aside and say, what does the South Africa look like going forward? Or what is the South Africa that we want to then see? And how do we build it? And unfortunately, you still have other positions that are not seeing that or wanting to then get into that. But as I said earlier on, I'm torn in between, because as a Democrat and as somebody who believes in the Constitution, and the Constitution is very clear about freedom of association, I want to then say people have a right. But at the same time, I'm sitting where I am saying, but if we continue in this trajectory, are we really gonna see the end of the disaster and the beginning of a new and prosperous build up?
Yeah, I think in politics, as in the economy, competition is quite important, because competition drives down the prices, and you want to drive down the cost of government. So maybe I think there's definitely a point to be had there. So I just want to end off with one area that I think that we still need to touch on in terms of job creation, Moeletsi, and that is the importance of entrepreneurs. I referred to you as a little bit of an entrepreneur earlier. But in terms of job creation, how important is it to foster entrepreneurship within your economy?
It's very, very critical. That's why the small business and the medium-sized business sector is so important in an economy, because that's where the entrepreneurs start. You, as an entrepreneur, you start as a small business, and if you succeed, you become a medium-sized business, and so on. So that's how economies diversify. For example, that's how they absorb new technologies, is through the entrepreneurs. If you look at what is the largest multinational that has been produced by South Africa since 1994, it's MTN. It was a new technology, and it was a private company. So that's how the economy grows. MTN is now all over the Africa, it's all over the Middle East. It employs hundreds of thousands of people. So, but it started off as small. So it's very, very important that we encourage entrepreneurship in our education system. We remove the red tape again, like the obstacles that the Minister of Home Affairs is putting in front of spaza shops, and so on. So entrepreneurship is central to absorbing new technologies, to applying new technologies. It's the entrepreneurs who will apply the new tech. It's not the old companies that are mining coal or mining gold. It's the new entrepreneurs that will bring the new technologies from artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and all that. So very central.
Solly, you elected Premier. It's sometime early in June. What's the initiative that you will put in place in government to cut the red tape so that we can get the entrepreneurs to start their businesses?
Well, Fred, as part of our Ready to Govern, we have actually put a document together that talks to from red tape to red carpet, which then centralizes or ensures that there's a one-stop center that is able to then do things to legalize the ability of doing business even for small businesses. We are not wanting to just introduce more and more regulation, because that's how you end up pushing people to operate in an illegal manner. But you want to then ensure that the ease of doing business is a one-stop shop. You can walk in. There is somebody who can help you with the registration of the company, the tax. The people should be there to be able to then assist you. If there is also a need for you to then look for funding or whatever the case may be, you are able to then also have a database of all the funders in the particular field. There, being able to then say, if you're looking for this or you're looking for that, this is where you're able to then do it. That's what we now need to do. That's what we want to then do, and we want to then introduce that. But as I said in the beginning, I'll say this in closing, until such time as government is able to show its seriousness of attracting investment by themselves investing, you are not going to go anywhere. If we cannot invest in our own infrastructure, if we cannot invest in our own police, and make sure that people and goods are safe, if you cannot invest in road and in road infrastructure, in our water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, in our schooling infrastructure, in our hospital infrastructure, we're not going to get there. But ultimately, we also now need to then say what kind of economy we want to build. Are we building the skills for the economy that we want to then build? That for me is what is going to then take Gauteng from where we find it now to greater heights. We must forget now. I'm not saying that we must now not mind the remaining gold that is there or other minerals, but I am saying we must now start saying, what does the Gauteng of 2050 look like? If you then say that Gauteng of 2050 looks like this, what are you doing now to prepare that Gauteng? And that infrastructure, that education that you're investing in, that safety and security that you're investing in, that are things that we're going to need to look at. We're going to need to then start talking about and have a government that has that as a base in terms of how it operates. That's how we're going to get the economy going.
Moeletsi, to end off, you, like a very good businessman, you see a lot of opportunity in Gauteng that I gleaned from your earlier answers tonight. What would your advice be for a new government to realize that potential that lies in this province?
Well, the potential of the province is enormous. First, it must realize that Gauteng is the hub of Southern Africa. It's not just the hub of South Africa. And that's where huge opportunities are sitting at a regional level. If you take the SADC region, there are 600 million people in SADC region. And South Africa, the Gauteng economy is at the center That's why we're having so many immigrants. I know lots of people are saying, oh, get rid of these immigrants, illegal, whatever you. The reality is that it is because we are the hub of the economy of Southern Africa that there are people coming to Gauteng legally or illegally. So we have the Gauteng government, whatever new Gauteng government we have, has to realize that the opportunities are in operating as a regional hub, not just as a small province in South Africa.
Moeletsi Mbeki, the chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs and a businessman, thank you very much for your valuable time tonight. We really appreciate it. It was great having you. Solly Msimanga, our premier candidate. Solly, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, man.
And we'll see you again next week. So next week, we will be unpacking the question about how do you win the fight against corruption. So join us again, same time, same place, and bring your questions along. And myself, Solly, and whoever our guest will be, surprise, surprise, we'll see, will be unpacking our fight against corruption. See you next.